Welcome to the post-battle discussion for the Death Rider Schweben series. This is a little different from the usual content, something I'm trying out for the first time, so it's a bit rough around the edges, and because it's over 2 hours long, definitely more about the audio than the visuals. That disclaimer aside, what you're going to be listening to here is Rice, my opponent, and Domfluff from the Combat Mission Discord, talking with me about the game, the setup, how it panned out, what our competing plans were, where it all went wrong, and how best to use the Soviets in Combat Mission Cold War. So, hope you all enjoy it. We'll see if this is a format that we can try again sometime, and I'll just dive straight into the recording.
Death Rider Schweben videos. I was Hapless's opponent. Thank you.
And we also have
yes.
Dom. Yeah.
Yes, I'm Dom. I have opinions. I am in the CM Discord, and I thought I would be useful if I could help out here.
So, this is the Death Rider Schweben wash-up. So we're just going to kind of go over some of the things that happened in the game, why it panned out the way it did, whether it, a few minor changes that could have gone differently, and the big one, which is did the Americans totally outclass the Soviets in Combat Mission Cold War? So, to kick things off then, Rice, what did you think of the map?
I thought it was an interesting defense. Using that word deliberately, I structured myself after seeing this map. I really didn't believe I was going to be able to do any offensive action at all. I think you kind of would have had every attack I could have possibly made covered. So I was structuring myself and my plan around defending my Schweben. So you had to come take it from me, which you did try to do. But luckily, since I was more focused on defending, I had some stuff where they needed to be from the start, which really saved my butt quite a few times.
Yeah, and I mean, my broad plan was to get to Schweben and defend it as well, as far as I actually planned. So, my initial concept of, attacking on a broad front, I sacked that off pretty quickly because there was all that high ground on either side that I assumed you would be able to very quickly cover with, especially toes, those scary M901s.
Yes,
which
so,
is exactly what you did.
I did. Unfortunately, my M901s really weren't able to nab any more kills than my M60s were, which is interesting. Each tow vehicle only got a very few vehicles each, if at most. So you did a really good job of denying them first with smoke over the obvious overlook on the approach to Schweben itself, and then on the left flank you didn't put anything up the railroad, so there really wasn't much for that thing to shoot at. And on the right side, most of your tanks were in hold down for the significant majority of the game and were not really making themselves visible to a reverse sloped M901. So very props to you for denying me the use of those. That would have been a huge advantage.
Also, that company at the back on your right also not exposed to the M901s, but not necessarily doing anything useful either.
That is true.
So
they didn't do that much. They did lock down my M60s that were pushing to your left side of Schweben.
Yeah.
Speaking in your familiar terms for left here. So your left, my M60s push up there, and that tank company did deny them. It took out two of them, which was pretty big, or it took out one and another tank, another defensive position, took out another one. Mm-hmm. But they still, when my perspective, I thought it was both of those deaths were from you at the top of the hill there. So I didn't realize that you had guys that were able to get shots on me from down in Schweben. So I was really scared and hiding in that tree line for the rest of the game with those guys. So they were kind of out of action. They weren't really doing anything.
Yeah.
And just at the end, you had some guys rolling up to try to mop them up.
Mm-hmm. Which all went wrong because the game was ending, so I told them to go quick.
But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, I think we should want to talk about how you made the map. Because you cut this down from the Schweben master map.
Yeah,
and maybe talk a little bit about your decision-making.
The quick version is we set out to do a tank-heavy meeting engagement, principally between M60s and T62s, and a map for that it needs to be relatively open, with some terrain in it to make it more exciting. So it's not a pancake. And Schweben is the one that really fit the bill of the master maps, because the combat mission Cold War quick battle maps are, should we say, maybe not the right size for combat mission Cold War battles.
They share the same. They have the same problems because they're imported from Black Sea and Red Thunder, which I'm sure Dom has some nice comments on, considering he's working on releasing a pack of cut down master maps for quick battle maps in Cold War that are really great. I'm sure will be great. Yeah.
Not even cut down, just literally turning them into directly, just to have some number which are the right size. So yeah. I mean, the map is what, 3x2, and you set up 2 objectives which were the same objective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
3x2 is correct. My rule of thumb is a dimension which is 3 kilometers is correct for a Cold War map, at least. The defining terrain, in much the same way that sort of Bocage is the defining terrain in Normandy, then the defining terrain of Cold War is hills and clumps of forests. Hills have an interesting effect because with the way dead ground works and line of sight works, hills can mean that you can have multiple kilometer line of sight, and then suddenly have sub 1 kilometer line of sight. So if you read the terrain well and you use the terrain well, you can end up controlling the engagement range to the range which you want. And since the US and the Russians and Soviets both have very different preferred engagement ranges, that's really key to make a Cold War map a Cold War map rather than a Black Sea map or a Red Thunder map or anything else. So yeah, the map is good, basically, is the point.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think it presented unique challenges and opportunities for both me and Hapless.
Yeah, I think in the earlier on, we were kind of talking about asymmetric map design. So, one of my concerns, like after the battle, was I could really get to my part of the objective easily, without any kind of exposure whatsoever, which meant I could run around back there without any feeling of risk, really. Whereas Rice had a much more exposed route into the other side of Schweben from me, which I was dropping cluster munitions on.
Yeah, so that was a big thing, is I wasn't able to get my guys not only into position, but set up and able to do anything before you were right on top of me, which is really props to you for a very surprising... It definitely was not expected in the least for you to be able to pull that off, so I thought that was a really great initial thrust. It threw me off kilter from the start, and I had to react to it, which did force me to lose and sacrifice some troops, which we'll talk about once we get there. But
once we get there, yeah.
Once we get there.
So what troops did you bring? You said you were aiming to fight a defensive battle.
So I brought since we were talking about kind of M60A1 versus T62 tank battle conceptually before we started this game, I brought myself a tank battalion task force. So I brought 1 company and then the battalion level assets, and because we had a special rule where you can't modify formations, I just had to cut it down into something that made sense and could fit with the point value. So 1 tank company, which is 2 of the company HQ tanks, 2 platoons of tanks, which are 5 each, and a platoon of mechanized platoon, which is 3 M113s and 3 squads. So that also comes with in the battalion a scout platoon, which has the scout teams, which we were just talking about in terms of my reactionary force. So a scout team mounted M113s and 3 M901s. Also, headquarters company. The headquarters company, which is scout platoon belongs to, is just a headquarters team in an M113, and the battalion HQ, which is my last 3 tanks out of 15, which is the HQ 3 battalion level tanks, the TAC CP team, and the 3rd Armored M113A1. And that's for you.
Yeah, that not what I was expecting, because I was expecting you to take like the armored cavalry formation. So for reference, that's each platoon has 3 scout teams, 4 M60s, and 2 tow vehicles. Yeah, 2.
Sounds right, yeah.
Yes, 2 tow vehicles, 2 tanks, and scout.
Which is to cut a long story short, like we were talking earlier, you have a lot of options, you have a lot of layers to it. You have the scouts with the dragons, then the M60s, and then the tows, and they all operate at different ranges. but like you were saying, Dom, it's very brittle. Like it's
extremely brittle.
Yeah, it can't sustain casualties and still continue to function.
Yeah, you don't have any redundancy.
And is that a problem? It's a problem primarily if you're on the offense. And there's an interesting question about who the offense was here. Because if Rice was looking to attack with that, there's a problem where he can't sustain losses and still be an effective formation with a cavalry platoon. And so, is that a problem? And maybe it depends on what you're trying to do.
Going back now, let's talk about your forces, Hapless, because you definitely surprised me with how much material you had. I did not expect you to have a whole battalion.
Yeah. So for me, it was definitely an exercise in as many tanks as possible. So definitely some kind of tank battalion, because we were focused very much on that like T62 versus M60A1 kind of engagement. It almost had to be a reserve tank battalion with the T62s. And then the earlier version, the 1972 version of the T62, on top of that, to fit it all in and give me some points left over. And then my main problem was that I basically had a choice at the end of my force selection between being able to take enough artillery to be useful or enough reconnaissance to be useful, and I kind of needed both, or both would have been nice.
And obviously, a problem with the T62 selection is that the 72 version doesn't have the laser rangefinder, which is something of a rarity in Cold War. There's very few tanks that do have laser rangefinders in the whole lineup. So having the 75, having one is a huge advantage. You were debating between having the T62 and the T64. The main difference is basically that you can get 3 T62s for the price of 2 64s. So it mounts up a lot because you'd be cutting your tank size by a third. So your 3 companies would be 2 companies.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Could maybe argue that I only actually used 2 companies, but that's different. We'll get to that. Different
question, yes. As pointed out before, I think the matchup, the matchup between T62 and M60A1 is something that is in all the literature and was well studied, and it's worth noting that the outcome, or the predicted outcome, if you like, was very much that the M60 would have the advantage at range, and that basically under 1 kilometre, the T62 should have the advantage. So they were expecting an average engagement range of about 1.5 kilometres, up to about 2, a maximum for the tanks, where the tows could reach up to 2+, and anything inside 1K is really T62 territory and very much in favour of the Soviets.
So, and kind of to give more context to our decisions to choose a tank-heavy game, the reasons why we went with the giant tank game is mostly because of the recent Cold War updates to battle sight zeros. The battle sight zero on a tank, as many of you know, is the range that guns are set to before they go into battle, because that's the average range that they're going to be engaging at. So they can use that to quickly acquire and get a really much higher chance of letting a first-round hit on a target. So, for example, before this update, the M60 and all tanks in the game had an 800-meter battle sight zero. And now with this update, they've been put properly. So the M60A1, which I was using, is 1,200 meters, which is much more reasonable, especially on this map. And the T62 is 1,500 meters, considering it's the fastest-firing Sabo tank gun in the world, even till today. That has largely to do with its ammunition, but that had a very flat trajectory, which was very scary for my T62s. Excuse me, my M60s, which we'll talk about my push on Hapless's left later, but he was able to get some really amazingly good first-round hits on there. But that's just kind of some more context there.
Yeah, so this is all feeding into my plan, which was to really try to exploit that valley in the middle to close the range with Rice as fast as possible, and avoid that kind of killing envelope that the tows had, where I couldn't really reply that well. Well, we'll get to later how whether going to point blank range with M60s was a good idea, but certainly the first phase of it worked pretty well. You're saying that it was a bit of a surprise to find Soviet troops in Schweben when you got there?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I arrived in Schweben, I was greeted with a dead squad, but I was not expecting my troops to get engaged so quickly, and I was really not expecting you to be able to not only get there before I could set up, but have a lot of mass behind that. So you had, and I didn't know this at the time, an entire third tank company in the woods there. I didn't think you would have that many tanks. So I expected about 2 companies max, and considering I spotted one where I thought I had seen them, I didn't believe that was going to be the case. So when I rolled into Schweben, those M113s weren't intended to be suicided or thrown away. They were just caught off guard, unfortunately, and I lost almost all of my rifle platoon, or half of it at that time, to that surprise. So that was a really costly and event that forced me to react by bringing my scout platoon out of my left side of the map into this forest, dismounting them. They had 2 tanks with them, pivads as well. Dismount, use their dragons to kind of throw you off balance a little bit, just as a little bit to kind of slow you down, because you're really punishing me for not being ready when you got there. So my M60s kind of were coming in to provide fire support on the buildings
Elsewhere, Hapless, you've asked previously, or you posited the question about what my IFVs are for.
Yes.
And I think this close range engagement in Schweben is a very good example of that. A very good example of the kind of capability which an IFV will give you, which an APC doesn't. Because that's a chaotic situation, right? That is not a situation that was under your control, that was under either of your control. That was not a situation you are either necessarily expecting, because you didn't expect M113s to roll through your lines. But in that situation, you suddenly have the low velocity 73mm and ATDMs and infantry, all the rest, all at this very close range, all online, where Rice didn't, because Rice had some metal boxes with some infantry inside, which got killed essentially in the initial stages. And it's dealing with that kind of I think IFVs are fundamentally a compromise, but they are dealing with that kind of chaotic situation, or that sort of hypermobile situation, where you may well be in situations where you benefit from concentrating as much firepower as possible into your maneuver element, into something which is mobile and there. And that I think is why it's that next level when things are not necessarily under your control and things aren't necessarily going exactly how you want it to be.
Yeah, I mean, like I said before when we were talking about this, I'm pretty well conditioned by now by Shock Force and Black Sea to almost write BMPs off.
Yep.
Whereas in Cold War, it's fantastic.
Yes.
And that really shows in the way I fought this battle.
Yeah. So the BMP-1 was a revolution, and Cold War is the first competition game where you can see why. Because even the BMP-3 in Black Sea, or even the BMP-2M in Black Sea, or 3M, that doesn't redress the balance, if you like. Like the relationship between the BMP and the armor of a period is not the same. Like even a 2M with the AT-14s is not going to take out Abrams from the front, right? Really. Whereas in the BMP-1, with its main gun, with its heat rounds, its main gun can penetrate all NATO armor from the front, even the Chieftain, right? So it is that situation where, the BMP-1 is very scary, and the BMP-1P is even scarier. And the BMP-2 is terrifying in Cold War because you can suddenly you can do everything. It's incredible.
Yeah. So on that kind of note, Rice, is there a way that you would if we played this again, would you handle that move into Schweben differently? Like, do you
Absolutely.
think it would...
I really
yeah.
I now knowing what I do know about, because I didn't expect you to be able to get there that quickly at all, but BMP-1s are fast little buggers. Anyways, yeah. I would have not deployed or tried to deploy so deep into the town, I would have probably been a bit more conservative with my estimates as to where you would have been. Tried to set up my infantry up in the buildings on my side of the town. Maybe try to get some more stuff to position. If I had M68A3 TTSs, I would have been able to deal with you moving up through that gap a lot more. I had, in terms of where I deployed my covering forces, I had nothing covering that approach except an M901, because I didn't expect you to be able to do that at that time. That's where my infantry were going to do, is support that center with dragons and not let you exploit that. But like I said, you did a great job of denying me that dragon close-in defense, so I was very heavily punished for that. My M901s were mostly... And we both have had a previous game at Stichenhausen, where my two cavalry M901s were able to wipe out the strength of your wipe out most of your forces single-handedly, which was pretty huge.
That's why I'm so scared of M901s.
So I had mine in positions where I really thought you're going to dedicate yourself to, because they're going to make quick work of anything they see, especially with the ITO. But because you were smoked out where I put the only one covering your advance, the ITO can't shoot through smoke. The M91 can only see through smoke. So I knew you were coming there, but I couldn't do anything about it. By the time I realized it, everything was a little too late, and I had to kind of, and like I said earlier, I forced my hand with a scout platoon, which you said earlier that you thought it was another infantry platoon, and I'd taken another one out of my company. Which so just since it was just a battalion level scout platoon, they had some dragons, which was really great because I was able to use them, and with the other two tanks there, do a little bit of damage to first kill on here on max setting there, but
still the best name for a BMP ever.
Absolutely. Yeah. So he went down, and I think I got maybe one or two more other vehicles, but what they did do, opposed to doing a lot of damage, was, I think, surprise you and threw you off balance a little bit, which bought me a little bit of time to react. And then you threw a tank company at them, which destroyed them utterly.
Yes.
But that tank company in return also died. So that's
the crunch point for the entire game. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So.
And before we get there, maybe you want to talk about your strategy and kind of what you were thinking of doing. Because if I was to do this again, I would have been even more conservative than I already thought I was being. So as a summary of that.
I would probably lean heavily on one of Dom's diagrams, which we'll see later. But yes, certainly I think for me, big mistake number one was ploughing like the whole or most of that BMP company into Schweben, because my plan was to go up, get in your face, contest that objective, and then look for ways to get past you and get find some isolated little piece of an American unit and crush it, but in a very nebulous and poorly planned way. Like we were saying before, a slightly different outcome in that first engagement in Schweben. If it hadn't gone so well for me, like I didn't take a single casualty for a couple of turns, I think, and clearly ended up dominating at least my end of the town. If that had gone another way, and I was 50-50, then I would have probably committed to bypassing the town much earlier, and with much greater force, which could have gone and taken the game in a completely different direction.
I agree, yeah. I had my mental image of what you were going to do, my mental idea, was completely different from what actually happened. And I don't know if you're going to put the diagram on the video 1-to-1, but I thought you were going to split your forces, your companies, on equal axis of advance. And that center company would have been the BMP company, considering I didn't think you were going to be able to bring 3 tank companies, plus the BMP one. So I had a whole tank platoon, one of my 2 tank platoons, dedicating to watching your right flank going into Schweben, or what would have been my left flank, because you get it. I'm going into Schweben. So I had a heavy expectation that you were going to throw dudes over the railroad tracks. Had a tank platoon stationed for that in the wood line behind Schweben. My other tank platoon was to hold down on my right and stop you from pushing your tanks across that giant open field on the top, which I thought there was a good chance of you, because it would have been great tank country for lining up in a Soviet wall of tanks. And then the M901s were kind of support to that. But you went straight down the center, so I didn't get a chance to use any of my M901s almost. And you really challenged me. So I was really lucky to have that one tank platoon that was sitting in the tree line waiting for you to come down the railroad, because they were able to react to that tank company very quickly. And I knew from watching your turn-by-turn series that you had suspected that might be the case, that I might have something right back there to come challenge you with. I don't know how much you were expecting an entire tank platoon there, but plus there's a few extra assets there as well, actually. So that was about 8 tanks originally, and went down to 7 when you got rolled up beyond my flank a little bit. But that was a lot of units right there.
So one question. Bryce is expecting you to advance on 3 axes simultaneously. And I've seen his diagram, so I know that's true. Why? I know you were considering that. So what made you choose not to do that?
So this is, I think, a big part of this is this. To me, there's a tension between, say, Miller's doctrinal scenarios for the Soviet stuff. Like, this is how you do it. You line up and you advance, pause, shoot the crap out of stuff, advance again. In this very controlled environment where you have heavy artillery support and a very focused, very specific objective, etc., etc.
Yep.
And to me, in my head, looking at the terrain, and like you say, I considered this early on. Oh, I have 3 avenues: advance, left, center, right. 1 company on each, and we push forward. And the company that survives gets the BMP platoon, the BMP company, to back it up. And I kind of looked at that and thought, this plateau on my left flank is like 600 meters across.
Yep.
That's going to take me forever to get across, and I'm going to be completely exposed. And I don't trust the ability of my tanks to see things or sustain casualties. So, and the same on the right, like on the railway. It's
interesting.
Yeah. It's that kind of like, so this is how I think I'm supposed to do it according to the drill. And then I look at it and it's like, okay, I don't think that's going to work. So I'm going to go up the center. We've got this dead ground here. I'm going to smoke off the other end of it and just punch straight for Schweben.
So I think I don't. How to put this? I think you may be missing. I think you may be misunderstanding some of the intended lessons of the drills.
Yeah, I think after playing that battle, I can agree with that. Yeah.
So worth having a disclaimer, actually, because obviously it's an awful lot easier for me to criticize and critique, because I didn't have to do it, right? And it's obviously with hindsight and everything else, so clearly that's into there. But I think so. The Miller's tutorial scenarios, which ship with Cold War and are fantastic, and I would love to see more of those kind of scenarios with every titling competition, because I think having this kind of doctrinal test, like this is what it's supposed to look like, and if you can't do this, you don't understand it, right? That kind of thing is great, and is really valuable, and would solve an awful lot of problems, because a lot of the scenarios of the campaigns can then throw you curveballs. They can throw you things which are more difficult or more complex, or don't have this kind of straight line approach where everything works as it is, and then you can have an opponent who's trying to stop you. Inevitably, in a quick battle, you're going to have a human opponent who's trying to stop you. So you're going to have curveballs. So it's going to be an awful lot more complex, a lot more nuanced than it kind of is. I'm going to talk about this now because I think it's actually worthwhile talking about it now, actually, about the general approach. Because that axis of approach is, I think, fundamental to this battle. And I think there's something interesting to say about this, which I'm happy to repeat later if we need to, but I just want to say anyway. Axis approach. I saw basically 2 ways in which you could approach this. I think one route we're going to the left and one route we're going to the right. The 3-axis approach, I think, was wrong, but it's wrong for an interesting reason. The interesting reason... So, the rule of thumb with the Soviets is thinking 1 formation level up. That's not entirely correct, but it's close enough, right? So, essentially, where you would send a squad, you send a platoon, is the rule of thumb. And it's the same thing for Red Thunder, the same thing for Black Sea, the whole lot. So, the idea that a platoon in the Cold War is a single unit, which you're using online as a single block. You're not splitting up a platoon into two halves or whatever. It is one single thing. So therefore, you're firing maneuvers between two platoons, that kind of thing. You're one level up the entire time. The level up, the comparison is with the US Combined Arms Company. Because the US Combined Arms Company, if you look at the one, say the NTC campaign, right? In that Combined Arms Company, you have a platoon of tanks, two platoons of infantry, the HQ elements, mortars, and a couple of tow vehicles, right? That is a very powerful, very flexible force that can do anything. It has all the tools it needs. But it's also a force that can do one thing. Like, all those elements need to work together towards one goal, and they all support each other, and they all work very well together, but they have one mission at a time. Applying the rule of thumb with the one level up, that means that your one Soviet battalion is doing one thing. So the three avenue approach at this level is wrong, I think, because you need your combined arms level is a battalion level. So your battalion level needs to be, you need to choose one route and send your entire battalion in this route. And in the broad scheme of things, that's quite a blunt instrument. And there's room for nuance within that, but it does mean that trying to do that kind of piecemeal approach is just going to lose horribly. And you need to choose which of the routes is actually better for you initially. And we can talk about it later, but of the two routes, which is basically going to the left of Schweben or the right of Schweben, I prefer the left. You went right. We can talk about why later, but I think I understand your logic to the right, but I think it was wrong.
Yeah, I mean, we can... the reason I went right was because I had a tank company on my right.
Yes.
On the stream, on the other side of that stream from Schweben. Yes. And my impression was that there was a rifle platoon with dragons in the wood across the way from it.
Yep.
And that if I stayed where I was, I would have a lot of static T-62s sitting around in the tree line, waiting to get a sky full of cluster munitions.
Oh yes.
That's why I decided to attack that wood. That's the crunch point.
So for me, so I'll talk about it a bit now anyway. They won't talk about now. So for me, the difference between the left and the right approach around Schweben, in the very broadest, the largest scale sense, the left hand side is open with hills, so you've got these sight lines that come and go. The left hand side is very complex and has layers of woods. The reason I don't like the right, so the Soviets will be stronger at closer ranges. So attacking into using the right hand side looks good because they're going to reduce the ranges in which you're engaging at, which is great. The reason I didn't like the right was that there's so many layers of woods that you're going to have a very hard time getting enough mass on target at the same time. Because trying to get your ideal situation, and again going back to tutorial scenarios, your ideal situation is one where you've got a company of tanks which is all engaging with enemies simultaneously, because probability and because you're trying to roll as many dice as possible. Because it's a numbers game and it's absolutely about trying to get the first hit on. And I didn't like the look of the right because those woods looked far too complex for me. And it looked very much like you had a wood where, Rice could defend that first wood and then could fall back, and then now he's invisible because he's blocked by the woods. But then there's a tow vehicle in the next wood along, and then you're doing this stop-start where you're fighting every 100 meters or whatever.
You're
is another
playing it exactly how the Americans doctrinally would like to play it. Yeah.
That's it, and it's just in a small, complex situation. And I think that was my main thing, where there's no easy way to just outmass him, because you can't fit enough tanks in one place to actually make the difference.
Yeah, I mean, this feeds into the overall thing, like going up the center. I've got two companies and a BMP company. I want to stick up that center. I can't send them all on the left side of the stream because there isn't room for them to all move fast. And I need to move fast because the smoke's not going to last forever because it's a really windy day.
Yeah.
So then I have another company on the right side of the stream, which is the one which is on the right. And once it's up there, I can't really switch it to the left at all. So it's just kind of predetermined, that That was the crunch. Like,
Yeah.
I have to stay or I have to go.
So broadly, when I'm saying left and right, I do mean left and right of the entire map. I mean left and right of Schweben entirely. As in, the majority of your forces went center and right, and I think that was wrong because of the I didn't like the look of that, rather, because of the layers of woods and the conflict that they burst into there. And yes, I do think partly, and also the fact that stream divided your forces was another problem. It really gives you an issue of maneuverability in space, which isn't what you want as the Soviets, because you need high firepower.
I have a question for you, Hapless. How did you think I was going to defend, generally speaking, as the Americans on this one? Or, excuse me, I should say attack, because this is a meeting engagement after all. But
yeah, I wasn't sure what you were going to do. So, like I say, my plan was to get up in your face fast and make you react to me, which succeeded, I guess.
Yeah,
I just wasn't... Yeah, this kind of feeds into what Dom's saying, which is that, yeah, I did that, but I wasn't actually in a position where I was in that center there to actually really do much about it.
Yeah, so I think you really did have a lot of initial success, but you kind of hit a wall in terms of possibilities, especially once Third Company was gone. There wasn't really a lot of... You had tanks on the left side, but they weren't really going to be able to do much because they were stuck back there.
Yeah,
it would have taken quite a while for them to rearrange and move.
Yeah, I mean, that one of the big things that I would do in hindsight is just, what's the way to put it, just kind of integrate things better. So, kind of already said that it would have been nice to have more artillery, but at the same time, bringing the artillery I did have together in a more in a better way to actually support going forward might have been a better idea.
So on that point, I mean, the Soviet army is described as an artillery army, and that's not an exaggeration. Your fire plan is absolutely the most important thing that you have to do as the Soviets in this sort of situation. All of your artillery assets need to have a point and need to have a purpose, and that purpose needs to be in support of your maneuver. It's something which I see still an awful lot on the forums, and people are still think about artillery in terms of its exchange. Like, I'm going to spend 400 points as artillery. How many points can I kill? And that's not the point, right? It's all about how it's going to support your scheme of maneuver and how you're going to deny certain terrain or suppress certain terrain or cover different moves or deceive. But just how you're going to use that to control your overall large-scale plan is vital. And there were elements of that in your description, but I don't think that was anywhere near extensive enough. And I don't think you had enough artillery. But even with the artillery you did have, I don't think your plan was using that enough and was really pushing that as much as it should have been or could have been.
Yeah, like there's a definite, and I definitely felt this at the time. It was kind of, I have a plan for the first 5-6 minutes, and after that, I'll wing it. It'll be fine, and it wasn't.
My favourite thing, a lesson I've learnt, a harsh lesson I've learnt quite recently, playing this. The Soviet order structure is incredibly useful. Is designed in an intentional way, and the Soviet order structure is incredibly useful and incredibly powerful. The way that the Soviet orders work is that every unit will have an objective, and will have a subsequent objective, and will have a direction of further advance. What that means is that everything always is thinking what's next. And so every single unit should have an idea of, you're forced into thinking, after I've done this thing, what am I doing next? How am I going next? Where am I moving next? And everything should always be this. One of the ways you get around the call-in times with the Soviets is exactly that, where you're already setting up the next call-in, the next artillery mission, while you're moving these forces there, so that by the time, if everything's juggling correctly, by the time these forces are here, the artillery is coming in to support them to do their next thing, because you're already 3 steps beyond every time. And it's this kind of whole mechanism where you absolutely need to be always thinking ahead. And the individual, and the part of that is because the individual scale, because the individual platoons and companies are so simple that you don't need to think on a small scale level about how your individual fire teams are working, because you're not thinking about fire teams, you're thinking about, here is a line of tanks, right? But the question is, where is this line of tanks going to be next, and then after that, and then how's that going to affect this unit here, and how's it going to coordinate?
Which was mostly not there.
Yes.
In this battle. So, I think, moving on to the actually attacking those woods on my right, I think that the big thing to me in hindsight is I smacked those woods around with 2 companies worth of T-62s firing HE at them, and that was actually completely enough to do what I wanted to do, which was, remove the threat from that direction. Because I thought there was not just a scout platoon in there, I thought there was a rifle platoon, and there might be even another dragon team in there maybe, but that's something a bit different. I definitely, at the time it was very definitely like a 50-50, do I do this or don't I do this? Because I know this is dumb. And again, it's kind of very terrain dependent. Like, there was quite a narrow approach where I thought I could get away with it, because it was screened from Rice's stuff that I knew was in the centre that was shooting up Schweben.
So I've already talked about how I didn't like that entire avenue approach to begin with.
Yep.
As in, I didn't like the idea of fighting through there because it's so complex. There was an interesting thing that, based on some comments that were made on the videos and things that you actually said during the videos, was that you were talking about that engagement being unlucky for you. Which it was. Like, absolutely, you're going to roll the dice and sometimes they're going to come up against you. My problem, I think, with that statement or that line of thinking is it's like playing Russian roulette, right? It's like, if you play Russian roulette and you kill yourself on your first bullet, then you are unlucky because it's a 1 in 6 chance or whatever, and you just killed yourself, just shot yourself in the head. But you've chosen to play Russian roulette. Like, you've chosen to put yourself in a situation where that dice roll is going to happen.
Exactly.
And that's the feeling I have, that, again, if you can't be in a situation where you can guarantee that you have enough pairs of eyes on the target, and therefore enough dice rolls to make the odds not matter anymore, then what you're hoping is that you are giving yourself situations where you are relying on getting lucky, or whatever, and it's very hard to judge because war games are inherently Bayesian, and that's probability is the thing. But it's also, I suspect that's basically the reason why I didn't like the right, is that you're putting yourself in those situations where you're...
Yeah, and like you say, there's layers of woods, so it's like, so we're going to roll the dice, and then we're going to roll the dice again, and then we're going to roll the dice again.
That's it.
And probability says you're going to have a bad day at some point here. Yeah.
And you've got to get lucky every single time.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, I think that's why I didn't like the look of that, because it just looked like it's territory that the US and NATO forces in general are designed to fight in, and they're trying to fight in.
Yeah. So that's kind of like a greater scope issue, and like we kind of said, like, I've managed to position myself into a catch-22 on my own, and say I need to do something. So if this tank company stays where it is, it's going to die, and if it moves forward, it's also going to die. And I can't move backwards because we don't do that.
That's it.
Maybe that was a good option. I don't know.
So the problem is that you also, with the map being 30 minutes, 30 minutes I think was fine for what you're trying to do. It is tight, and it's going to create a battle where you're both rushing, but I don't think that's necessarily a problem, either doctrinally or otherwise. I think, being on a tight time is not necessarily an issue. But it does mean that your initial approach to this, especially because you're the good little Soviet commander that you are, is to do your terrain analysis and do your time analysis, and to sit down and work out that, I have 30 minutes, this is what I have to do, and you fully commit to that approach. And the idea of trying, if you don't fully commit to that approach, you're just losing time, and that 30 minutes suddenly becomes a problem, because now you don't have 30 minutes, you've got 10 minutes, or whatever.
So we kind of established that it's not a good idea at the greater scope. A bit further down, what was it like to be on the receiving end, Rice? Because
I have a few comments on that. So I already talked about this a little bit. My tank company that was meant to defend against a railroad axis of advance, or excuse me, my tank platoon, was really lucky to be in that position, because as soon as third company rolled across and out of that woods, you had them halt for a second to fire. So I had the ability to roll my tanks up just in the nick of time to really douse them and take out most of them in a pretty quick order. And then I had my two tanks that were, I think, surprising you, behind the tree line, and they got a good number of kills too. So it was kind of, again, like Dom just said, rolling the dice per se. It didn't work out for you that time. I know you've done some extra testing, and I know it's going to be some video, but it might be interesting right now to hear a little bit about how that could have gone differently, do you think, on the ground level, even though operationally, or not operationally, on the scale of this battle, that was, I think we could fairly agree, kind of an objectively a choice that maybe had to be made, but it wasn't a good one. Yeah.
So we're going to put this together in another video because it deserves its own little deep dive, because it says a lot about combat mission. But I basically rerun that turn where the tanks come out the other side of the wood 30 times now, and on average the US forces destroy 4.1 T-62s, including Sergeant Spook. He dies in every single one.
Okay, good. That's very good.
Because there is literally an M901 at the back of the map aiming at him at the end of the last turn.
What's funny is in our game he misses.
Yeah, that's the way. Like, just the best possible result is both M60s go down quite quickly. Sergeant Spook dies, of course, and then another one is destroyed by an M60 in the centre. The worst possible result is almost the same as what actually happened, except one of the M60s survives.
Oh, that would be nice.
Yeah.
So back to what actually happened. My tank platoon, that rolled over, that was in the tree line that was against the railroad. I just had enough, just 1 minute. So it was kind of surprising to see you roll that tank company there, but I wasn't too worried about it, because even if there was a bit of a breakthrough, I had that M901 as insurance. I could continue to maneuver my forces. I wasn't super concerned about it, to be honest. I think it was definitely something I had my eye on, because I had an M901 in the forest behind that as well that was originally smoked out, that was just hanging out there for most of the game. So even if those tanks did break through, I wasn't too concerned, but I think that seeing them was definitely surprising. I did not expect that. So I was very lucky I was able to react to it in the way I was, and successfully.
Let me ask you a question, Bryce. So if Hapless had burst through that woods completely by surprise and wiped out those forces that were immediately arrayed against him, what's your next move? Like, what did you have available that could have reacted after that point?
So I had about equal number of tanks on the top of the hill. So I had about, before he pushed his guys to flank my M60s, I had about 8 M60s on top of the hill, which is a very large number of M60s concentrated in one area. If his T-62 company was able to, on a dime, rotate and take out a lot of those M60s, I would assume a worst case scenario, assuming things went different and actions went different, I had lost those. Are you suggesting it was all the M60s or most of them? Because if I lose all of them, I would have to literally
just attack on that tree line. If that attack of tree line suddenly goes incredibly Hapless's way, and you have to react to that flank. So there's a move where suddenly you don't have the defenders on that flank that you think you do. So it doesn't have to be everything, but certainly, like, what else did you have that wouldn't have been engaged at that point?
I would have had almost nothing. I wouldn't really have been able to deal with them. I would have tried to quarantine and space them out. I wouldn't have been able to. Because the greater problem of taking that tree line is that also denies my left access to the point I need to hold. So he can start enveloping me. I know in hindsight, we know you didn't have extra forces to go kind of buffer and back up that third tank company once they committed their action. But assuming third tank company is mostly intact in this scenario, they would have been able to possibly do a lot more damage to the back of Schweben and even encroach on it, perhaps, which would have been very scary. I would have had to reposition my M901s to deal with that, which would have been me kind of gambling to see where I can get them, because I have to make bets on where Hapless is going to go, because the M901s are not vehicles that can handle point-blank engagements. They have to be set up and in the right position. So it's mostly it becomes a matter of, can I assume what he's going to do with these tanks now that they're there, and can I prepare for that with the M901s? I don't know if considering I don't know what he would have done because he has options. I think there's a 50% chance I would have been able to hold it off or prevent him from completely surrounding Schweben.
I think what I would have done, given as it panned out and the losses that I took on the way in, if we got the best result in the actual tree line, I'd still have 6 or 7, 5 or 6, I can't remember, T-62s in there. They're not going anywhere because they don't have the numbers to sustain any losses and still do anything useful. So it was, like I say, probably more aimed at having a force in that area to cut off your route into Schweben to reinforce what was left of the rifle platoon, and to have a fixing effect. So my guys are in that wood, my tanks are in that wood, and you need to contain them. Like, you need to leave something there watching it, which in theory should take the pressure off somewhere else.
Yeah, that would have allowed you to, if you wanted to move anything up the railroad, probably. If you wanted to exploit the giant hill on the left side of Schweben, you could have done more because I wouldn't have an M901 watching it anymore. I don't know if I would have really been, because I did have those M60s in hold down. I think I wouldn't have chosen to do anything with them if you had done that, because that was a big portion of my tank, a third of my tank force just sitting in hold down, doing nothing for most of the game. I think was kind of a waste of resources. They were insurance, but I feel like they could have been in a better spot.
Yeah, like I didn't. Once I figured out you had so many tanks behind there, I didn't want to go anywhere near it. Basically,
that's good that it kept you away.
So it kind of worked both ways.
Well, so I do find it interesting that you're talking about the M901s as their performance being disappointing in this match. The M901s, the TOW missile, fundamentally being sort of central to the US everything in this, or the US doctrine certainly in this period, and it's interesting that you got more use out of your tanks in this particular engagement, which I think was probably part of Atlas's part of the consequence of going to the right and sort of having that using that approach. I think probably limited how much the M901s could actually do.
Absolutely.
I would say the flip side to that is that this problem that we've been talking about, where I'm like in behind Schweben and I need to move because I'm going to get RT'd, and I'm stuck in this bowl because I specifically tried to avoid the M901s. So just the threat of them had a significant shaping effect, as it were, in like Brit speak.
Yes.
So I want to quickly bring up, I don't know if John might have thought of this, if I had M150s versus if I have N901s, because that's something I definitely could have done considering the force. If I don't, considering that we are only going for doctrinal formations, I don't see a scenario where I ever don't bring M901s when I have the option to, because they are game changers, especially with the ITO. But so let's say I took M150s because of house rules or particular restrictions, perhaps, or earlier date and time. I don't know if I could say that the battle would have gone any differently, which I think is interesting because of how you chose to react. And I think if it's more of a question geared towards you, how would you have done differently, or what would you have done differently if I had M150s for sure? And
so
you knew
so
that?
If I knew in advance you had M150s, I would probably be still thinking that you were bringing a cavalry force, and that I'd still be looking at either 4 or 6 of them.
A lot of them, yeah.
So
Yeah.
I don't think it would have changed my planning at all.
Okay. It's interesting because I'm not like there is a capability. There's an obvious capability increase between the 901 and the 150. The 901 having 2 tows, not 1, and yes, the ITO is better. But in broad terms, though, a tow's a tow. If you're not, especially if you're not looking at T-64s, then you're going to kill everything in one shot anyway, and they're going to hit. And yeah, they are a bit more vulnerable, and you don't have 2 of them. But yeah, it's. I wonder in this case whether it would have mattered terribly.
Yes, I agree.
something I don't think we've really dived into too much is, while I'm sending this company off on its literal death ride, I brought what was left of the other company, second company, round on the other side of Schweben, thinking I was being clever. Picks up a lot of the issues that I kind of have with this idea of Soviet tanks in lines.
Yep.
And that was that actually only 2 of them could get line of sight.
Yes.
Through the buildings.
Yes. Well, so this is, I mean, I don't know when you want to talk about what I sketched out to you at the time, as in what I would have done instead. But this is part of the reason why, again, I think that is the idea of firing through the buildings and the idea of going the right in the first place are going to compound that. And that's why I liked the idea of going left where it's big and open, because you have the opportunity to do that far easier. And you can, by using your artillery, you don't necessarily have to put them in a situation where you are firing through the buildings and you are limiting your lines of sight, because you can restrict what Rice is doing. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting... to me, my stance going into this whole thing is, where can I go where I'm not going to get hit by toes, or I'm not going to get shot up by M60s, which, like we're seeing, is severely limited what I thought were my options. Whereas kind of what you're advocating, Dom, is don't worry about that. Sort your fire plan out. Obscure yourself with smoke or smack at, hit enemy, potential enemy positions, and fragment their defense, as it were. And that way, when you have mass and you playing with Lanchester's law, and you can overwhelm what actually sticks its head up.
Well, I mean, should we talk about how I would approach this? Is that the time to do it?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So there's a few rules of thumb and a few things that needs to be considered, I think. Obviously, the first thing is mass. The second thing is you need to keep moving. Because the US artillery is so fast, or so much faster than you, and effective. You saw exactly how fast the cluster munitions can relocate onto your position, because they can do that within a couple of minutes sometimes.
2 minutes,
especially
just
in
for this time.
Exactly. So you cannot afford to stop and slow down at any point. This is also a large reason why not dismounting is a thing. With the Soviet, obviously, fighting from the BMP is something which there's various sort of NBC reasons, but also fundamentally, if you're dismounting, you are slowing down, and if you're dismounting, as you did in Schweben, you're going to get clustered and you're going to get artilleried within a couple of minutes, and it's going to take you longer to run away and get there. Your approach into taking Schweben, other rule of thumb. Third rule of thumb is about is fundamentally how you win combat mission, if you like. And it's fundamentally that what you need to do in the broadest sense is to do something that makes your opponent react to you. As in, take a move or take an action which forces them to react to you. And the way in which you make that decisive is you then make a situation where you prevent them from reacting to you. So you're doing something that forces a reaction, and then you're preventing that reaction from happening in the first place. And that combination means you end up with something decisive, because then they have to react to something and they can't. So that's how it goes. So my look at this map and thinking about this, I think you were quite correct to contest Schweben, but I think you were contesting it with the wrong tools. The BMPs are an offensive element, not a defensive element. If you did want to contest it with infantry, and I think that's a bad idea, but if you did want to contest with infantry, then the right tools to contest it with are the BTR infantry, because the BTR infantry have the 87s and the SPG-9s and the assets to do that kind of hasty defense. They're designed for that purpose, right? The issue is, I think that approach was completely sensible for Normandy, or something that was if there's a load of Panzer Grenadiers or whatever, that's completely sensible. But in this case, I think it's wrong, primarily because of how fast the US artillery is. So, what I looked at this and I saw the Schweben, and I saw a line of trees that's going down from Schweben towards a big triangular patch of trees there, and then a big patch of open ground to the left of that. To my mind, if you had a battery of 152s that were bombing Schweben, a battery of 152s on a medium intensity, maximum duration mission have a mission time of 35 minutes. Now you have a 30-minute map with 35-minute mission time, so you can completely deny Schweben to Rice for the entire duration of the map with one artillery asset. You can then look at the tree line and that triangle of trees, and if you are using more artillery to deny those areas to Rice, then what you've got is this diagonal line down the centre of the map, which is going to split his forces from left and right. Now, as it happens, looking at where he actually deployed, if you had done that, you would be stopping his, you'd be blocking his 901s from getting line of sight to you. The tanks on his far left would be blocked. He has another set of infantry and 901s, it looks like, which would be hit by that tree line denial. So all you'd actually have on the right to be available to do anything with are basically that one tank platoon. So you'd have one tank platoon and one 901, I think, which would be able to get to you, because he wouldn't be able to hit the tree line. So the approach then would be to mass absolutely everything on the left and lead with the tanks and go all of the tanks over the hills as fast as possible to try to get to there. And his platoon of tanks would have to deal with your entire tank battalion. And yeah, they get some kills, but you would lose that entire left flank. The artillery was stopping his forces from bringing across, because he wouldn't be able to use that tree line, because the tree line is being hit by artillery. So he can't have his 901s in there because he could be killed by 122s or whatever. So then what you'd have is your BMPs would be screening. So your BMPs would then be sitting, there's a curved line of trees to the left of Schweben, and that's where your BMPs would be setting up. And they would be stopping his reaction. So you've already denied him the terrain, you've already made the action that he has to react to, which is the massive left push that's very, very quick and is far earlier than he's expecting it, because of that size he's only got the one platoon. And then you're denying his reinforcement because of the artillery, and then you're locking it down with the BMPs. And the BMPs are then defensive, because the BMPs are standoff and can then use their ACGMs from a defensive position to then stop him moving into the tree line. And at that point, then you've got a line of BMPs. You're a stationary target; they're a moving target. You're going to see them before he sees you, and you're going to have mass BMP fire to stop whatever he can do to do that, including doing an M1 around Schweben entirely. So that's how I saw it, as something that's very much more dynamic. Oh, the tanks, by the way, the tanks would go on the left, but they would literally go on the left and do an entire end run. So they would push up there, they would run the thing and keep going, and they would keep going all the way around the back. So all the time, Rice is having to make decisions about where he's going and what he's doing. Like, is he going to try to stop you, hit you in the flanks of the tree line? Is he going to try to go around Schweben and take you that way? Is he going to try to that one? And each way is bad in different ways.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I think that would have been extremely as Dom laid out. I would have really had very little to no options that would have been good. Or
Yeah,
I don't know what I would have done in that situation. It depends kind of how it played out, but I would not be in a good place.
See, I'm like 75, 25 in favor.
Mm-hmm.
I would
and
have.
obviously it's easy to say, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think to me, I love the idea of it, and I think it would probably work, but I think it would be really painful. Like, having spent a lot of time on the map, and I think this is what affected my planning so much, is that I look at that and I think there are so many places there could be like an M901 or an M60. And
so this is on the dice. No, you're right, and this is on the dice. The point is, yes, what happens if Rice stacked all his stuff on the right and they had a massive defense? And yes, this is Soviet, right? You are raising the terrain. You're looking at it. You're going, this is the correct approach to go. And yeah, what if you are inevitably rolling the dice because you're always operating with incomplete information. So to complete that story a little bit, what you would do is you'd use a platoon of BMPs that would be ahead of the tanks, and your platoon of BMPs would be your recon element. Their job is to go the exact same route the tanks are going to go down, and to run forward and to find where the enemy resistance is. They're not going to change your scheme. At no point are you going to change direction or do anything else. All you're trying to do is you're trying to send a platoon of BMPs forwards to find. They're not trying to kill themselves. They won't necessarily fight to the death. They are still going to whatever. But their entire point is to find the enemy line of resistance. And what they would have done in this case is they would have found that platoon of tanks, and then some of them would have died, and they would have gone behind a hill. But you then know that there is a platoon of tanks and not much else. And then you roll over knowing that this is where the enemy is. You know that there are no 901s in the woods or whatever, or there's one 901 or whatever it is. And you'd have that kind of situation. But it's all about choosing which dice to roll, right? It's choosing where to roll a dice and then committing that dice roll and trying to minimize your risk at that point. But yeah, you don't have the forces to be flexible fundamentally. You don't have
it's like I love the sound of it, and I can see how it would work, but at the same time,
it's a very different mentality.
I think we need to think about the adjustment it takes to think, because I'm a very mediocre Soviet player in my opinion. I have a much harder time playing with Soviets because I have a very American mindset that I think is much more directly translatable to the newer games and the World War II games.
Yeah, I think I'm kind of in the same boat, which is that I haven't played much Soviet stuff at all. Not even that much Red Thunder, which has been out the longest. Inevitably, I'm kind of coming at this in the way that I kind of picked up playing Combat Mission over the years, which is...
Don't expose yourself to a tree line.
If you're going to move undercover or suppress the enemy or things, bounding Overwatch, stuff like that, and which I would never want to do here because it's so open and scary.
So again, it's larger scale. You know that there can't be N901s in this tree line because this tree line is going to be hit by 152s or whatever. That's the kind of logic. You are proactively denying this terrain, and you're shaping the terrain with the artillery in a proactive way, not a reactive way.
Yeah.
And it is a very different mentality, and it's fascinating. It's interesting actually, listening to John Curry, the professional wargaming, the wargaming.ca website, but listening to John Curry talk about Soviet tactics, and he is an artist. John Curry has an article about Warsaw Pact tactics in wargaming. That article talks about the difference between Soviet tactics and NATO tactics to a large degree. One thing I find fascinating about that is how he describes the Soviet tactics as being significantly simpler and significantly easier to grasp as a newbie, as a new player. And I agree that that's not the experience I've had from Combat Mission at all. I do. There's a difference in mentality between doing it, because there's a difference in it's not even throwing things away, right? It's very much because it's Lanchester laws, right? It's very much if I run over the hill with 2 tanks, then one of them is one or both are likely to die. But if I run over 10 tanks, then maybe one dies, maybe none of them die, because one of those 10 tanks is going to get a spot first and they're going to kill them.
Yeah, it's like Slim, I think this was talking about in Burma, talking about tanks. The more you use, the fewer you lose.
Yeah. And it's Lanchester laws in a very literal sense, and a lot of the Soviet stuff was very, very scientific, it was very mathematical, and was very centralized for that reason. And an awful lot of it was trying to take as many of those kind of decisions away from the low levels as possible. That's one of the fascinating things about Cold War, is you can see that. And again, comparing the mechanized company to the mechanized battalion and seeing how the battalion is doing the same job that company is. They're doing one single task, and that one single task en masse is is where it goes. And it does mean that, if you're forced into these complex, changeable situations where you have to adapt and you have to make things up on the fly, as the Soviets, you're going to suffer because you don't have the tools for that. So what you need is a bold, simple, but not necessarily unnuanced, right? It can still be sophisticated, and it can still be clever or detailed, but it has to be broad strokes, right? It's got to be this is the scheme of maneuver. This is where I'm going to deceive you. This is what I'm going to do in these large levels.
Yeah, I mean, like my issue is I can't always see this working. Like, to some extent, this is the why 79 to 82 is so interesting for Cold War, like tactical level stuff, because you're at that tipping point,
yes,
where mass starts to stop working, and we're kind of, it's easier to think of it as Bradley and Abrams are super scary, but is it also happening much earlier? With the caveat that I feel like this would be much more successful with T-64s.
Yes, so that's the thing, and it isn't straightforward. Is obviously the point.
Yeah.
And yes, you're right. The earlier they go, the easier it is. And it waxes and wanes. Like it's the general opinion of a lot of people a lot of people have read that essentially this kind of folder gap type Cold War situation in the late 80s certainly would have no hope at all of working. And I agree. I can't see that being functional. And a lot of that tech comes down to semiconductors. It does come down to the TOW. It comes down to a Dragon. It comes down to a lot of those kind of the communications. Again, it comes down to ammunition. There's all these things which will help and will help redress the balance. And the Soviets weren't without that. Like the T-64 has a huge uptick in armor. And you talk about a tank which weighs pretty much the same, right? It has pretty much the same mass because all the Soviet tanks were pretty much under 40 tons, and they're under 40 tons for bridging because it's an awful lot easier to lay a 40-ton bridge than a 70-ton bridge. So they were all within the same spec. You suddenly have this tank which has pretty much the same size, more or less, and has a tremendously powerful gun and has massively powerful armor that renders all of your heat stuff pretty much useless because you can't get through a T-64 turret with a Dragon or with a Shillelagh. And yeah, it is a huge deal. Briefly, because it's less of a deal with ITO and it's less of a deal with A10s and with cluster munitions and all this other stuff, which comes down to it. So it means the later you go, the more of a roll the dice it is. But I do think you can do an awful lot to put that dice roll in your favour, and an awful lot to really does it work? I think the whole point is to get inside the OODA loop, and I think that is what this can do very well. Because
that's one of the things that comes out of John Curry's article, isn't it? Where it's like, the Soviets, they're doing command push. How can they be making faster decisions than us flexible NATO types? And the answer is battle drills, and you say, like you say, this is your first objective, this is your second objective. That's your direction of further momentum.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
I had a question for you, Dom, kind of about the objective, the first coming in, the next, always having another objective in mind. You've played a Cold War scenario, or a quick battle, I believe, against someone. It was a very large map. You had a rather small force, but you had, the interesting bit is that you had artillery planes that were for the following objective. So you had a pre-planned artillery here, you had pre-planned artillery here. Mm-hmm. So as soon as you complete one objective, assuming you got the timing right, your artillery would start falling on the next.
Yeah. So exactly.
I think that's a really interesting way of thinking that I don't think people would traditionally ever think of doing with combat mission.
No, it's so important because the artillery, you're playing around your long calling times, but the artillery plan is vital because it has to be there to support your maneuver. it has to be there at every stage. So, just for example, with the idea of splitting the map with the artillery is fine. I'd like more artillery than I have in that scheme, right? And I would like more. What I would like is to have artillery denying the town, artillery denying the wood line, and that triangle of wood. But I'd also like some artillery denying the woods that are behind that, because that's where the tanks are going to go. And whether those are TRPs or whether those are, they probably can't be a pre-planned mission 15 minutes in. They can definitely be TRPs. So if I bought some I would probably not buy TRPs for any of that initial fire plan with Schweben and the tree line, but I would probably have TRPs in those woods that are behind the tree line, behind that triangle wood there, because those are where the tanks are going to go, and the tanks are going to get around there, and they're going to be hitting there, and that's how I would do that. I think, assuming I had infinite points.
So
Now,
points are a good question.
Points are a very good question. Right.
How do I phrase
How do we
this?
feel about it?
This is where we get into Dom's opinions with a big O.
We do. Big opinions.
Attacking. When I first was explaining what was happening here, I think just after it had finished, you were kind of surprised that this was a meeting engagement.
I was. So I think a meeting. Okay. So just to define terms for a second, with combat mission, a meeting engagement has equal points values for both sides. It also splits the victory points, 400 for terrain and 600 for casualties. For an attack, the points values are 1.65 to 1. So the attacker has 1.65 points for every point there. So there's a good 65% increase on their points value. The reason why I was surprised by this being a meeting engagement was that the Soviets are always going to be the attacker, no matter what situation they're in. Even defensively, even in a defensive situation, the Soviets would work on three lines. You would have your initial scout forces forward, you would have your main line of resistance, and then you'd have your counter-attacking force. One of the problems with requiring mass, you've got to get multiple eyes, multiple guns on target simultaneously. And just in the abstract sense, a defense, you're going to have to spread out with a defense, and the attacker will choose some subset to attack. The problem with that is that if you're having to spread out on defense, there is no way to force them to attack into all of your guns simultaneously. So you're never going to be able to mass your defensive firepower. The way around that is to have a relatively thin defensive line and a strong counterattack. So even in a purely defensive battle, you're really the attacker as the Soviets. The problem with that is that if you're the attacker needs more points, because the attacker is going to take more losses, inevitably. It's easier to defend. So if this is a pure symmetric meeting engagement, that means that you are basically giving up points to the US, because the US is going to have a stronger situation by being defensively, in the pure abstract sense. So I was expecting this to be an attack. And I showed you my suggestion for what I would have taken if this was an attack of the same thing. By comparison, that was to take the equivalent formation. There'd be 262-75s, be a couple of shulkers, so be a reserve tank battalion of 262-75s, so 3 companies, a couple of shulkers, a BMP 1P rifle company, and then 2 batteries of artillery too. So 2 6-gun batteries of artillery, one was 122s and one was 152s. You could have got, for the same thing, you could almost have gotten 3 batteries of 122s. In fact, you definitely could have got 122s, so actually got points left over. And that would have been a force I'd be happy taking in this situation. Like there's points available, there's things in there, and you can do some serious stuff with that. You've got some serious options. Having a meet engagement means you're giving up points. You are surrendering some of that to the US, and you're doing that. This does mean, I think, that if you're going to do it as a meet engagement, you probably should have added something on the force adjustment. You probably should have given the Soviets more points, because they are really attacking, even if they're not. How much you give them is a different question, but I do think they probably should have had like the plus 40% or the plus 70%. Probably the plus 40% is probably fine, but just to give them something more, because the onus of attack is on you. The burden of attack is on the Soviets, and that's always going to be true no matter what.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So getting kind of, we've had a lot of talk about the Soviet discussion. I think we kind of, for the sake of time, we might want to talk more about how the game maybe went on a smaller scale too. Just kind of touch off towards the end of that, because even though we covered most of the big actions, such as Third Company's tank push, my reaction with the tank platoon, I haven't really had some time to talk about my mistakes in the game and kind of things I really could have gotten punished for, or probably should have been a bit more punished, and things Hapless did to deny me. Besides, the M113s, I don't know if I would necessarily consider that a mistake, but in hindsight, that was definitely not a good move on my end to lose them. But so, for example, I think one of the worst wastes of things, the biggest waste in the game I did was move my tank platoon on Hapless's left over the field, try to get flanking shots on the remnants of one of his other tank companies that was flanking my M60s, which were firing down on Third Company. By the time they moved, that company was dead. They weren't really a threat, and the survivors had moved into defensive position. They were exposed to, I think, First Company, which was on the Hapless's left over the field, hold down, and it was just a complete waste of 2 tanks. And that was 2 out of 5 tank losses. 40% of my tank losses were basically me doing nothing except sacrifice. And that was, in hindsight, that was a horrible idea. And I don't think, even just with hindsight, that I should have realized that, I think I could have, that was definitely something I should have thought about a bit more and not done. I other than that, I think that's probably the biggest single waste I did that game, which was kind of lucky on my end.
What I found really interesting about that, and this sort of goes back to my concerns with, Lanchester's law versus fragmentary line of sight, which is I popped up an entire company of, I think there was 9 tanks left, 8 plus the battalion commander, and only one of them had line of sight.
It's interesting. So were all of them? Sorry, so was it one spot or all of them?
The far left of the line. This is probably my timing, because by the time I'd seen what you were doing and reacted, and the First Company wasn't in position to really take advantage of it, and they popped up, turrets popped up over that ridge line, and only one could actually see those M60s before they went behind that line of trees, and it spotted it, and it took it out, but it got taken out in return by another M60.
I think I was doing bounding Overwatch, so there's either 2 or 3, only 2 or 3 exposed.
I think it was the 2 at the back. I think were still exposed. And the other one got taken out by one on the reverse slope, close to the Schweben.
Yeah, I think I said it earlier, but I thought that was actually from the top of the hill. I didn't really expect you to have guys in there, because I had hit it pretty hard with Cluster earlier, and luckily there were some survivors that I did not anticipate. And speaking of Cluster, I feel like I could have called that in sooner. I don't think I used my artillery very well this game. I could have done more damage to you with it. I know I got a few vehicles. I got 2 on the top with it. That was lucky, but generally I think the Cluster only got a handful of vehicles.
Yeah,
it really wasn't doing that much.
Fits in with my experience of Cluster, which is that it's not as cool as it sounds.
I think there's definitely more appropriate ways to use it that I failed to do, and I think it's a skill issue for me, because I have very little experience using it. And I think what you want to probably do with Cluster, I know Don probably has some thoughts on this, but maybe I didn't funnel your forces, or I didn't really have a good fix on where all your forces were, so throwing Cluster generally where I know you were was kind of all I was doing, was kind of flailing around with it.
So I would definitely say that the Cluster munitions on the back of Schweben fixed me. The stuff that I had in the village was stuck there, because although it wasn't causing many casualties, the infantry were just pinned down, so they were kind of stuck there until the actual high explosive shells started landing on them, which did all the damage. But go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, so Cluster is interesting. Cluster is very good at forming up points. Inevitably, you're going to have to move a tank company or infantry company or whatever, and it's very, very. At some point, they're going to have to concertina, right? They're going to have to move. They're going to have to recombine and then go for the attack. So Cluster is very good at denying forming up points. It's also very good for Cluster in general, rather than necessarily the DPICM. other thing it's very good for is covering a large area. Same deal as rocket artillery. If you wanted to do something like denying a tree line, like a long tree line, then cluster rounds can be the way to do it, just because you're going to cover a larger area with every barrage. Because one lot will go in and you'll do that circle, and that circle is going to be a larger area on the ground than your particular explosion is. So you're going to hit more, which means you're going to suppress more for longer because there's going to be more explosions. You're going to hit something in that area, is the point, or get near something in that area.
Yeah, or whoever's on the receiving end is going to go, I'm not going over there. That looks really scary. So you have,
and that's the thing.
You have the denial effect as well.
Yeah. So is it devastating? No. Don't think it needs to be. I think it does exactly what it is, which is to get this great big everything's going to hit in this area. It can. The point is, it has a potential of being so. It's like shock force. If the AT-14, the AT-14 can sometimes penetrate an Abrams frontally, right? It won't normally, but it can sometimes. It depends on where it hits. But the fact that it can means you have to be a lot more careful about your Abrams. If you know you're only fighting 83s, then maybe you can be a bit more bold with your Abrams and whatever. But the fact that every single missile could potentially kill you, even if most of them won't, means you have to be a lot more careful about what you're doing. And so cluster rounds can absolutely wipe out a tank company, potentially. And potentially is good enough sometimes. Because again, artillery is not about killing things. Artillery is about supporting your movement and controlling theirs. That's 100% exactly, like, if it kills things, it's great, but it's primarily about supporting the maneuver.
Yeah, I guess that makes a lot of sense. I should have thought. I guess that's some way I could have probably, I did pin his infantry down. And I did help deny him from really exploiting, because if he pushed all of his first tank company and possibly even second tank company over the hill and in the later stages of the game, even if they didn't have the time to necessarily, like, say there was another 15 minutes on the game, they wouldn't have really been opposed by anything except cluster. So I threw some cluster down to get them to dislodge from that whole down position. I think, and like I said earlier, got 2 of them. It would have been interesting to see how Hapless would have reacted, because I feel like if there was 15 more minutes, it would have been a good idea to kind of have that up there, because it would have helped prevent him from advancing and prevent him from taking advantage of something like that. So yeah, definitely that what you're talking about with the denying formations or forming points or routes. That's definitely a good way to use it.
Well, it's a rally point. It's absolutely it's denying the point where they're going to need to gather to do for an attack. It means that suddenly they have 2 choices. They can either not do the attack, or they can go when they're not ready, or they can sit there and die, which neither is particularly good.
Which it's worth again pointing out that this was the dilemma I put myself in prior to the crunch point attack on the right. Like, I didn't even know you had cluster artillery at that point. I don't think. But the threat of cluster artillery made me do something I maybe shouldn't have done.
Yeah, so that, when we talk about threats, we mentioned M901 earlier. It's kind of interesting how a lot of the U.S. defense, it feels like a lot of the U.S. defenses, the Soviets know that they're weak to this, or have a certain weakness to something. I mean, everyone's got a weakness to tows, but the point being that there's a lot of scary weapons the U.S. has, and maybe the core lesson is using them appropriately is where it really matters, because it's very easy for them to. Yeah, and I guess that applies to everything. But,
I think on both sides, sometimes it's how you use it. Like, BMPs are actually really scary, but I don't think I really made you scared of BMPs in that game.
I was definitely concerned about them. I thought I might lose an M60 to them, but I was lucky that my M60s were feeling a little bit more spotty than they were.
but it's also like Rice knew where they were. Right?
This is true.
Yes.
Because they just opened and then stopped. So Rice is then in control of that situation, and he can choose when and where to engage, which is the opposite of what you need to be doing. Because if those BMPs were suddenly somewhere behind in his rear and he's got no idea where they're going to pop out, then that's terrifying, because he's having to react to something he can't fully see, comprehend, deal with, and he's having to struggle with it.
Yes, this is another thing that came out with all those iterating on that turn, which is that most of the time the BMPs all got through.
Yep.
So how how differently do you think the game would have gone if that happened, Rice?
So,
So I know
I've
one,
lost.
one BMP went through, but
I've lost M68-3 TTSs to BMP ones before, so I definitely am aware of the threat of BMP ones in Cold War. I would have definitely, if I had BMPs going through my flank, knowing where I had my forces. So let's say they went through that forest past the triangle with the scouts in it, and they were chilling in there. I had an an M901 in the forest right behind that would have maybe been able to take out one or two before the BMPs took out it. Right? It wouldn't have been able to do much. Assuming it spots them at that closer range that quickly. I wouldn't have been able to do much except maybe direct a cluster and try to get them through there. Which is still a pretty tough call considering finding line of sight. Maybe direct some of my tank force. I thought about putting some more tanks in that forest line to hold the BMPs, which I did at one point. There's a forest line right behind my side of Schweben along the main road. To the left, there's a little tiny forest line that's pointing towards where 3rd Company got knocked out. So that's where I had some M60s for a little hot minute, kind of waiting to see if BMPs, because I knew BMPs were in that forest for a minute. I rolled up an M113 to try to see if I could 50 cal side shot one and be a little cheeky, but the gunner got shot out, so that didn't work out. And so those tanks were mostly there as a blocking because I didn't know exactly what those BMPs were up to, and I knew that if they were in a right spot, they could wipe out almost all my tanks.
yeah, like this is goes back to Dom saying I don't like the look of that right, which is as well as being layers of wood that you have to go through. There's another wood at right angles to the whole thing, so you're also flanked by prime defensive terrain all the way up. So
That's
kind of
the
funny.
yeah. It's even worse than it looked originally. Great, yeah.
Yeah, I really didn't like the right, just because it's. I get the logic of short range is good, but
There's a point where it doesn't matter.
if there's only one line, that's absolutely perfect, right? But there wasn't. It's just you're intentionally throwing yourself into complex terrain.
Into a terrible, complicated.
When you're not a force that likes complex terrain. Again, it's like fighting cities. Like if you're, if you're this force that wants to be fighting on West German plains and you're intentionally going to cities, you're doing something wrong. You're giving away your advantages.
Yes. So just nuke it and go around it.
Yeah. Or in this case, again, if you were denying that first town, denying Schweben with artillery rather than sending infantry into it, then you're not bothering with the fight in the town at all.
Yeah, I mean, even with my kind of original cack-handed plan, that would have freed up like a whole company.
Yeah.
Basically a company of tanks and a company of BMPs, which is a lot of stuff.
And a whole company which essentially didn't do a lot, because a lot of those infantry that you were sending into Schweben were sitting there to die and to die to artillery.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's yes, you had that initially won inverted commas that engagement with the M113s, and Rice didn't have very much in the way of infantry, so that was actually more serious than it looked. But even so, that was that's not. There wasn't.
It's even an interesting one from what's the word, from a combat mission quick battle mechanics perspective, because broadly speaking, a squad of infantry is probably going to cost you more in casualties than a tank if you lose it.
Yes.
Just due to the way it.
Yeah, because it makes a lot more crew. Yeah, it's true. One thing we didn't mention this time around was about the objective. Is actually worth mentioning here. So you set up the map so that you had two objectives that were the same objective. The issue I had with that was that if I looked at that, and no, I thought there were originally two objectives, but I looked at that and knowing there were one objective, I looked at that and I looked at that, and what I imagine happening at that point is that you're going to have at least one guy in the objective on your side, and Rice is going to be able to get at least one guy in the objective on his side, and you're going to end up with neither of you scoring the points for that objective.
Mm-hmm. Which is what happened.
Yeah. And The problem with that then is then you sending that entire company of infantry into there is completely pointless.
Yeah.
Because you're not doing anything. Because you're denying the objective quite happily by having half of it on your side of the map. So this is why maybe having those two separate objectives would be better, because then Rice is a situation where he can, like, even if you have the same plan or similar plan, then you could contest Rice's and keep yours safe, and then you can score your 200 points, and then neither of you scores the other point.
Yeah.
And having that fight, but yeah.
So, about the town and the artillery, one of the cheekiest, I think the absolute cheekiest moment in the game is when Hapless's cluster took down a building, and there was an M113 protecting little infantry inside of it that got RPG.
Yeah.
I think that turn came out today, actually. So now speaking of that, I watched a little bit of this one.
I can't remember. It's just
And
all
that was,
like an automatic schedule, so yeah.
That was a very
no idea
that was
what's
a,
going on.
that was pretty funny. I liked it.
Yeah, that was score 1 for the GDI over TechCom. It's, two named characters: GDI rifleman Connor and Kyle Reese. Kyle Reese is on fire at this point, I think. I can't remember. Not that rifleman Connors makes it out either. But...
I tried to hose those buildings. Oh, this is coming out after the series. I tried to hose those buildings with my pivads to try to, and I really tried to use all my 155 HE on the town, which I did make mistakes with earlier in terms of mission planning times. So my use of my artillery was, I would say, the cluster was all right, and the HE was definitely poor. I could have done so much more with the HE in terms of denying or hurting the town, because a 155 will easily take out a BMP at pretty close range. So it would have been nice. I could have done more damage there and closed up some more possibilities of those BMPs getting sneaky kills on the M60s. So, yeah, as we were saying, though, that I think being in that town, or maybe having that be a second objective, would have netted you at least a tie in this scenario.
Yeah, I think, yeah, it probably would have them, but on the flip side, it would probably have changed the dynamic of the whole thing as well. So,
do you think it would, though?
Yeah.
Do you think it would? Would you not? I mean, ignoring whether I think it's a good idea to contest the town with infantry in the first place, do you think that would have changed your approach?
So I think going into the town originally, it was an exercise in I can clear this out and get all the points. Whereas if I was just like, I'm not going to bother, I've already got half the points, I want to contest it and deny Rice the points, I think that would have involved a different approach.
Interesting. See, I don't look at the map and think you can clear that far town at all. Like I don't think Schweben looks like something which you can reasonably. To me, it doesn't look like something you can reasonably plan to hold all of in this context without defeating him in the field completely, like essentially without surrender anyway. You know.
Yeah, well, that was my issue. Is like I have all these troops in Schweben, but I don't really want to go forward because there's a load of M60s on the other side.
Well, that's it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So I don't look at that and think that's something which I could reasonably hold, especially because again there's all this complex terrain directly behind it. So there's all these routes in or routes where you can fire into Schweben. So like I can't see a situation where he can't get at least one person in somewhere to contest it when it's so close to his setup.
Which is I think kind of what happened, Rice.
Yeah.
If I remember, I have I can't remember. I can't say for sure because I couldn't see obviously, but was there a point towards the end where you didn't have anything in Schweben? Like in the objective?
Yeah. So,
yeah.
When you killed my M113, I think I might have had one more M113 just hanging out over there.
Oh,
but I brought in
bridge,
reinforcements.
Right? I can't remember.
Maybe I'd have to go back and check. I think that one might have died. So the entire platoon was completely eliminated. That was it. Originally went into the town. Everyone died. I brought in my HQ elements to occupy the outskirts of the town that were still worth points that you hadn't been able to control. So I brought in stuff to deal with that. I made sure the M60s were covering them, and I really tried to stamp you out, for all your influence out, by using my pivads, M60 area fire on the buildings, which I had done quite earlier in the game too to try to deny, because I wasn't sure if you're going to have ATGMs or or what, well, as soon as I saw the BMPs, I knew you weren't going to have anything huge.
Yeah,
But
I
I mean,
would
like
have really
ATGM
liked to have ATGMs.
I think that would have definitely changed how this went, and I think that's why I might agree with Dom that maybe if there was BTR infantry, even though they're not available for an armored battalion, would have been a really great fit there.
Yeah.
if you're
So
doing the contested combat.
Yeah, I think if you wanted to do this plan, which again I think is fundamentally wrong, but regardless, if you want to do this plan, the BTR formations are the formations to do this kind of plan with.
I agree.
Yes.
That's basically what I was thinking.
Like
yeah.
I don't think you can get a whole.
No.
I think if it's a tank battalion, it comes with BMPs, right?
Yeah, it has to. There's no substitute.
That's how it's set up.
So they update the TOE, so it goes. I think I have to check my notes, but they update the TOE around 1980, and it changes from 1975, 1980. They changed the TOE, so an armored battalion goes from just being up like 31 tanks to be plus like a regiment could go from being, it would go from being a battalion, so that's 31 or three companies. So that would be, you got your 31 tanks, but there's also the inclusion of a BMP-1 company later on, and so it's just a few spare ones. And I have to check my notes exactly when that transition happens, but that might have made things a bit more interesting to have an infantry company attached to your force.
So the reserve tank battalions can only have BMPs in their formation. So yes, if you wanted BTRs, you'd be looking at a motor rifle battalion task force. So you'd have BTR companies and the single tank company. That's what you're doing. And yeah, this is ones which have 4 tanks and 3 tanks, but fundamentally that's that.
That's probably the one change I would probably make if I was going into this again. Obviously I'd probably change it quite a lot, but without changing too much things. If I could only change one thing, I would probably ignore the rule about hull formations, strip the MGs out of the MG platoon and replace them with ATGMs, because I didn't feel like I could get anything out of the BMPs in Schweben, because they felt like they just got blown up the instant they tried to peak in M60. But I feel like if I had I think you can only bring AT7s or AT3s, and you don't want AT3s.
You don't want AT3s?
No.
Hang on, let me just double check that for a second, because the anti-tank battalions are the anti-tank guns and the AT and the BRDMs.
Yeah.
Let's have a look into there. Individual things, though. So if you wanted individual teams, you can have. You can have that one.
If you're really set on using a tank regiment, there's no organic ATGM vehicles except for IFVs. So a 1980 plus tank regiment has 3 tank battalions and a motor rifle battalion attached to it with no tanks. So that's the tanks being from the tank battalion. So it's kind of like a flipped proportion of a regular MRB.
Yeah.
And you got other regimental assets like an engineering company with your mine layers and your bridge layers, but that's not really, and the engineers, that's not really important. So I think it would have been interesting to see you have taken a BTR mounted motorized rifle battalion and see how that would have gone.
On the subject of taking whole formations, I get it, right? I understand why you would do that. I don't like min-maxing in combat mission. I don't. I think the formations that exist are as close as possible to the real formations, and the real formations exist as they do for a reason. I'm personally certainly more interested in trying to work out how to use the formation as presented, because those tools exist for a reason, and they're there. Not all those tools exist for a reason which is relevant to a CM battle, which is the first problem. So the machine gun platoons are a very good example. The machine gun platoons in the infantry companies are primarily a defensive asset, and they're a defensive asset after the attack is finished. So they are really along for the ride, for the most part, in the offense. And the idea being that they then deploy so that your defense, because everybody, the one lesson that everyone also learned from World War II was that counterattacks are very powerful. Because by the time your attack is done, you're out of ammo. And suddenly you're exhausted, you're out of ammo, you've got losses. And then if you've got this fresh formation coming in, then this counterattack can be very, very decisive. So with the Russians, the 87s, the SPG-9s, and the machine guns were there to have some kind of defense straight away, so that there'd be some way of just not immediately losing everything just gained. So I think there's a good reason to not take that kind of thing in there. I don't know. I get why you're doing it, because min-maxing too hard ends up with something which is very counterfactual, and it means you're not asking the kind of interesting questions that Cold War would ask, and you're not engaging with the Cold War on its own terms. So there's a middle ground somewhere, and I don't quite know what it is.
Yeah.
But we were talking a little bit about that earlier, previous recordings. Sorry, the amount of artillery you would realistically be available to you as a regiment, or a battalion, single battalion in a regiment. So we talked about how 3 batteries of 2S1s is pretty standard. 3 batteries of 122 could be 2S1s, could be, I think, D30s. Would be a realistic is a regimental level asset, right? And you could go further up. You get your MLRS, that's divisional, okay. But on a battalion scale, if you're not the main effort, or if you're the main effort, you'd ideally have all of those 3 batteries allocated to you.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe even like a military training scenario, you get the BM-21 MLRS, right? So that's the ideal scenario where you have every asset that you're realistically going to have given to you. While in reality, you could have been counter-batteried, you could not be the main effort, you could just be a medium-level effort, so it's, or defensive. So you wouldn't have those kinds of assets that would be available in an ideal scenario. So it's kind of interesting maybe to think about how, because you didn't bring maybe perhaps all the artillery that you could have in this, and kind of how is your force reacting to not having the suppressive power of artillery? Because all of my armor wasn't really touched by artillery at all. So watching how that's interacting with you advancing and attacking, obviously there's caveats and subjective scenarios that we're facing, but all my M60s didn't have to deal with that problem, which I think was pretty big, because all of them wouldn't have been able to see, or their combat ability would have been hampered.
With the Soviets, like Dom says, I think the fire plan is when it comes to the artillery, because you simply can't adjust it in a timely fashion. Also, if say your M60's behind Schweben, I would have to get my FO to a position where he could see them to actually call arty in, and that would probably take 10 minutes of call-in time, which I can't expect you to sit there for 10 minutes, and then you move after the first salvo, so it's just
Yes.
I
understand,
it's tough.
because this was a bit of a unique scenario too, considering I had to move into my defensive positions, which didn't give you going back to military training scenario, didn't give you the forward reconnaissance and deliberate reconnaissance that you might have had, or Bill, you might have had, before calling it a mission.
Yeah, but again, that's why the artillery has to be proactive. It has to be. It's not that you're bombing the place where the enemy is. It's that you're bombing the place where you don't want the enemy to be, and to have that be useful. Clearly, if that tree line is the best defensive position, is the best position they have to deal with the move you're going to make, and you're going to force them to try to react to, then you need that tree line to not be an option for them, and that's the kind of thinking you need to do.
That's a very good point, and I think that's kind of showing. Definitely for me, I need to work on my Soviet understanding a lot, especially for artillery usage.
Yeah, this is the fun part of Cold War, right? Which is this is so weird. How does this work?
Absolutely, and I've loved playing some of these games, and not just this one, but all of the Cold War scenarios do. I feel like or a lot of the scenarios do a great job, and especially the campaign Death Ride. All those are March or Die, excuse me. They're a lot of fun. They can really show you, I feel like, what you can realistically have to work with, and just like Dom said, those kinds of same questions you're dealing with.
Well, I said the one thing that the Soviet campaign teaches you above everything else is you have to keep moving. Like, you can never afford to stop, because the minute you stop, you're going to get artilleried, or there's going to be air power or something, and you just have to keep going and going and going, which means you're always having to think about what's the next thing, what's the thing after that. When these guys are here, what can I do over here? If there's indecision, if there's points where you're hanging back, then you're going to lose, and you're going to take excessive losses. Which doesn't mean they have to be just thrown in, but it does mean that you're constantly juggling, and you're constantly juggling all these different things that all have to synergize in the right way and make sure they're there to support each other at no matter what happens. And it's incredibly hard, like, because it's pushing all this kind of thing to a high level, and it means that you're asking an awful lot, because in the way that you're not asking an awful lot of your platoon commanders, you're asking a huge amount of your battalion and regiment commanders, because they're having to plan this all out and do a ton of work. But like I said, like, you need to know things like how long your artillery missions are going to last, which is something that CM doesn't tell you until you start doing it. So you need to know that, as I put up a list there earlier, but things like a battery of the 122s on a medium fire mission with maximum duration lasts for 14 minutes. And that's important, because 14 minutes is 40 minutes into your 30-minute mission, which means that, you can cancel it halfway through, because there's another, you can call them in later at a future TRP for another 7 minutes or something. It means you can deny that town for the full length of the mission, because it's 35 minutes and it's 30 minutes for the thing or whatever. And you're constantly playing with this kind of time and motion situation, because you need to be in control, and you need to be in control by pushing and by forcing them to move. But I mean, you had a fundamental question about whether you can play, whether Soviet tactics work in a combat mission quick battle situation.
Yes, assuming somebody does them right.
Oh yeah,
that's the caveat there.
Exactly, and I firmly think they do. I do think it's challenging. I think that Scrum Mission does show very well that they do. I do think that you either need to play them as an attack, or you need to play whatever you like, but probably give them some more points to make up for the fact they're going to be the one attacking, no matter what the mission is called. And I do think it's workable. I definitely think it gets harder as the day goes on. It definitely, I mean, yes, the Abrams and the Bradley are the obvious sort of overmatches. I do think playing 1980 with strict rarity is the balance point where you have a situation where everybody can do everything, but they can't necessarily afford everything. So you can still field Abrams, you can still field T-80s, but you can't really afford to have too many of them, or this sort of situation, or any of them. But yeah, I do think they do work. I do think they are. I do think it's a challenge, and I do think it's very different, and it's very different to playing everything else in combat mission. But fundamentally, it's just an OODA loop, right? It's just doing things again. It's taking an action to force a response, and then making sure that response can't happen. And you can do that. You have all the tools to do that.
Yeah. So I think I'm still undecided. I'm obviously going to have to try all this out, and try out being on the receiving end, for that matter.
Yeah.
I'm here for you, buddy.
Yeah. What are we now, Rice? It's now 2-1.
2-1 me.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, it's also incredibly easy to say that, and it's a lot harder to actually do it. Of course, this is the thing.
This is where I'm. It's the same with looking at, like, reading, FM 200-1 or whatever. It's like
it's 2-1,
yeah,
100-2-1. Sorry.
That's nice, but I don't think it's going to work, guys. That's my reaction to that. Just
yes.
It's a bit like I think this is a kind of quite a modern thing as well. I think this applies to Black Sea to some extent.
Black Sea is actually interesting to bring up, because I think I've appreciated Black Sea far more by playing Cold War, and I think I've understood Black Sea a lot more. Because one of the interesting things of Black Sea is that the fundamentals are identical across Black Sea and Cold War. You are absolutely, with the Russians in Black Sea, you are trying to do the same kind of things. But you don't have the numbers. So you can see, especially in say Russia versus Ukraine, you can see where all the advantages are, and you can see why. You can see what the BMP-2M is trying to do. You can see what the BMP-3 is trying to do. Like the BMP-2M is in some ways the closest thing to a BMP-1 that you get in Black Sea, because the BMP-2M can potentially kill any main battle tank in the game frontally. And there are downsides to that. Like, it's only got four rounds, they're firing in salvos, whatever. But it's trying to redress that balance and trying to gain some of that back. But it's also doing it in a way where they can't take losses, and so everything is a lot more constrained and a lot harder in that kind of tactical level. So it's what's fascinating about Cold War is you get to see all this stuff working as it's designed, without caveats and without the it's not like seeing the British in Shock Force, where most of their kit is Cold War kit, but it's 2008 and they're using it in the desert. And so the Warrior, which is fantastic at killing BMPs, is trying to use its limited HE to shoot up buildings and shoot up OMCONs. It's everything is exactly where it's supposed to be, doing the job it's designed for, and that is really interesting. And it does, I think, put a lot of that kind of thing into context, and it puts Shock Force and Black Sea in particular into context about what they're doing and why.
I think what I was kind of ham-fistedly trying to word was more along the lines of, are we kind of looking at this kind of First World War scenario? This is kind of a lot more like it on the Soviet side in Cold War, where it's like the fight that you want to fight is like an operational level, throwing divisions around kind of thing, but is some element of what we see in Cold War, this idea that actually tactically you might not have any traction. So given like the difficulties that I kind of see looking at the Soviet tactical level stuff, which admittedly I'm not 100% up on, is like, does it work?
So I think the interesting thing for me from the battle you fought was that initial engagement in Schweben. Like, quite aside from how I don't think that's a good idea in the first place. Ignore that. You were in a situation where you had two infantry formations that were stumbling across each other. Fundamentally, you were both running into each other at full speed, and you didn't expect either of the other to be exactly where they were at that time. And the end result was that you're both moving and you're both unexpected, but you had a bunch of BMPs and Rice had some M113s. So the end result was that basically Rice lost all his infantry. And you did that by doing something that Rice wasn't prepared for, and having this maximum force at the single point. Now, that's a tiny microcosm because we're talking about like platoon level, right? But even at that platoon level, the fact that the Soviet stuff is designed for this kind of concentration of force, this kind of push, it means that that BMP and that focus there was on a massive overmatch, and it meant that Rice had to do something about it. Now, you didn't have a plan after that point, which is the problem. I didn't really develop into doing anything and giving that advantage, but you did have an advantage there, right? You had created an advantage which you didn't have a plan to do anything with it, but it was there, and you did that by in the Soviet tactical way, fundamentally. So that in microcosm, I think, can be extrapolated to other things. And I do think you have the same situation. Yes, T-64s are better than T-62s, but even with the T-62s, I think you could have exactly the same thing by having this kind of concentration and this kind of mass situation. And again, if all your tanks had gone over the left, you would have had 3 companies against 5 GTSs. Oh, five M60A1s, and those 5 M60A1s would have died, and they would have taken out some T-62s maybe. But then what? Then what's Rice going to do? Because all his force is suddenly on his left, and you're on his right and in his rear, and he's having to scrabble. So all the time you've created this advantage, and you're also exploiting it because you're now pushing and going. I think that's how and why that works. So, yes, I get your point about the level 1 operational level. The point where I differ, I think, is where you draw that line, and I think you draw the line at the battalion level. I think Combat Cold War is perfect because it's exactly the battalion level is the important bit. Any lower than that, it's rubbish. Any lower than that, you have all these problems, and you don't see these problems. If you have a company-sized Soviet force, you can do it and it will work, but you're not having the tools that you should have to be able to do this kind of proactive and nuanced, juggling of assets in a way that will actually allow you to create advantage and exploit it. But I think battalion is the minimum, and I think battalion is you can do, and I think Cold War has the right size maps, and I think Cold War has the right size forces to be able to do it. Just about.
Yeah, just about.
But just about.
Yeah.
It would be interesting to see a more, this is still on the more of the battalion level, but see a Soviet force continuously in one game attack across a very, very long map, kind of as if it was, on a death ride, perhaps. It would be an interesting scenario to see develop, to have a U.S. player having to defend against a line of Soviets that they have a much harder time dealing with, but having a lot more depth as an option.
Yeah, I mean, it's the flip side is like the frontal attack is like not the preferred option, right? Like the concept is the forward security element goes in, and if it has trouble, it stops, and then the advance guard comes in from the flank, ideally. Let's
talk about that. So the training scenarios do two things. They do a frontal attack, and they do immediate engagement. The lesson you're supposed to take away from the frontal attack is two things. One, it's the importance of how you coordinate with artillery, and the importance of artillery. And the other is the importance of mass. And it really comes down to that, whoever in a tanking engagement, whoever sees first will win. The point being that in that kind of situation, you're going to have worse optics. So you're not going to see your individual tank 1 versus 1 is not going to win that spotting contest. But you don't need to win the spotting contest, because if I've got 10 tanks, then only any one of them needs to see first. And if one of them sees, it only needs one of them to see first to win. So if one of them sees first, then that one is going to get the shot off and is going to kill the enemy tank. And that's the lesson you're supposed to learn from that. The meat engagement. The reason why the meat engagements were the expected normal battle. So meat engagement in the Soviet sense is an attack from the march. So it's not a meat engagement in combat mission terms. The two are very different things. Meat engagement in combat mission. A meat engagement in combat mission is a war game fiction of having two people mashing into each other, which doesn't happen in reality all that much. The meat engagement in the Soviet sense is an attack directly from the march. So the whole point is you're in column because you're moving on roads as fast as possible. So then the question is, how can you attack directly from the march in an effective way? And that's the escalation. So at that point, you have a recon platoon, and the recon platoon is going to travel in a direction and hit whatever it hits. And maybe hits nothing, but maybe hits something, because you're always going to be dealing with imperfect information. Behind them, you have your FSC, which is your company with a tank platoon or whatever, and your reinforced company, which is then going to be, if that recon platoon immediately dies and transmits no information, then the FSC is going to be the recon platoon, essentially. The FSC is going to be probing and is going to be trying to find something, but ideally it isn't. Ideally what it's doing is it's then hitting whatever the mainline resistance the recon platoon found, because that mainline resistance is probably going to be recon elements of their side. So that one company can probably blow away the scouts that the US player has. And then behind that you have the main body. And if the recon platoon can't, the FSC can't blow them away, then they become a base of fire, so then the rest of the main body is then your main attack. In very much the same way that your platoon attack drills have that. Like, it's very much of, if this squad can suppress the target, if the squad can win the firefight, then the squad can do a squad attack. If the squad can't, it becomes a base of fire for the platoon. And if the platoon can't win the firefight, then it's a company attack, and you go up the scale that way. It's the same kind of idea, and it's basically just trying to deal with the fact that you're on a massive long column on the road falling behind, and you need to somehow turn this into an attack that makes any kind of sense.
I see.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a good note to leave it, because we are...
I think we're way over time.
2 hours, 10 minutes in. And this is the second time we've done that.
Well, the first time I don't... Even considering we were a little faster this time, we went a lot longer than I was expecting.
Yeah. So
great conversation, though, I will say.
Yeah, it's
definitely worth our time.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Rice, do you want to... you've got your own YouTube channel, yes?
Yes, I do have my own YouTube channel. I am going to be making I'm going to piece together a video with the footage from my side of this battle, and it's going to be up there eventually. No promises on when exactly. Depends on my schedule. I will, with Hapless's permission, perhaps link it somewhere under this video in the comments or in the description, and then people can find that or go to that if they want. And I really appreciate this opportunity to discuss this battle with Hapless. It was definitely challenging for me, and I learned a lot from it in this discussion. Thank you, Dom, for helping teach us and kind of being a third view here that isn't wrapped up in our own experiences. So I appreciate that. And thank you again to Hapless for being a great opponent.
Yeah, no problem. Like you said, we're going to have to get even at some point.
Yes, I think we'll have to... I'll play as the Soviets next time for sure.
Okay, yeah, I'll take that. And Dom, you are currently running the CM Discord?
Yeah, currently on the CM Discord.
Not the official one, the classic one, the original one.
The classic. It's like new code.
The one with more discussion and people, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, no, yes, kind of on Discord. Yeah, I mean, if you want to put a link below, that's fine. But is what it is. It's.
Yeah, so we'll call it a day at that.
Thanks very much for listening, guys. If there are any of you still here at the end of this marathon, we'll see if this kind of post-battle video is something worth exploring and iterating on in the future. But in the meantime, I will catch you in the next video.